Talk about Pet Sounds versus Smile.
Well, Pet Sounds, everybody liked, of course. People love Pet Sounds. But if you want to put it on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd give Pet Sounds a 4 and Smile a 10. That's how much I'd rate it.
Brian had sensed their presence for years. The demons had always been there, chattering softly just beyond the edge of his vision, poking at his dead ear, threatening him and making him dizzy. But he didn't always have to listen. Being with friends and keeping his hands and mind busy made everything better. As ever, the music was the real key. It brought people to him, for one thing. More importantly, it could drown out the demons even when he was alone. No wonder he had music at the center of his world, riding the childhood ecstasies to Rhapsody in Blue into the countless hundreds of teenage hours wandering the intricate, swirling harmonies of the Four Freshmen, which led him straight into the soul-cleaning power of Phil Spector's productions. And by then, he'd already made that world his own, adapting everything he'd learned from his heroes to build a sanctuary he could hide in forever. But now he could hear those whispers beginning to infiltrate into that world. The Capitol Records brass had already signaled the limits of their corporate patience, and once Pet Sounds faltered on the Billboard charts, the rest of the Beach Boys had more or less put him on notice. Forget the bullshit and get back to making hits. Everyone had mortgages to pay, wives and ex-wives to support, investments to keep afloat, offices to rent, and employees who needed to be paid. He listened and nodded, but he knew that he couldn't confront those obligations on their own terms. Instead, Brian looked to make music that was even more adventurous, still trusting in its power, and became determined to build a new sanctuary even bigger, louder, and more grandiose than the last one. All he needed to do was keep moving, keep working, to fill the studio with more musicians playing bigger, more elaborate things. The positive British reaction to Pet Sounds might have affirmed Brian's faith in it, if not his bandmates', but by the time his most recent album lit up the charts abroad, the head Beach Boy was already focused on his next musical vision. It was a song called Good Vibrations, and he'd been working on it on and off for months. It began during the Pet Sounds era as a kind of rhythm and blues track, its verses built around a minor progression with a heavy bass, organ, and flute arrangement that would have sounded at home in one of the Four Tops' gut-wrenching Motown love songs. In fact, the Tops' next hit, Reach Out, I'll Be There, used a very similar chord progression and Spector-influenced orchestration, and the two songs would race one another into the top 10 during the fall of 1966. But while Brian's tune was also a love song, his was far trippier. The initial inspiration came from an exchange he'd had with his mother as a child, about how dogs can sense if a person is going to be friendly to them before they even approach. They feel the vibrations, his mother Audrey told him, and the image struck him immediately. It scared me, the word vibrations, to think that invisible feelings, invisible vibrations, existed scared me to death, Brian told Rolling Stone in 1976. And yet the idea also appealed to him, particularly when he thought of lovers communicating on that same non-verbal plane. But as the song began to take shape in the studio, Brian began to realize that Good Vibrations didn't fit with the moodier, introspective songs that formed the nucleus of Pet Sounds. He put the song aside, even pondering handing it off to a soul singer such as Wilson Pickett or Danny Hutton, whom he had befriended. Hutton was managed by another mutual friend, David Anderle, who had recently started working for the Beach Boys, helping them set up a record label they would own and control. And the more he came back to it that winter and spring, the more convinced he became that the song should be even bigger than the tracks he was orchestrating for Pet Sounds. After all, he was writing about the higher frequencies. Why limit the song to any of the constructs that governed pop music? Wandering out past all traditional pop boundaries, Brian began to think of Good Vibrations as a smaller, psychedelic version of Rhapsody in Blue. A little pocket symphony, as he put it, built from parts whose distinct rhythms, moods, and sounds would flow together to form a larger, cohesive piece. To enhance the song's modular feel, he recorded different sections in different studios, using one room for its intimacy, the other for the grandness of its echo, and so on. "I saw the record as a totality piece," Brian said in 1976. But creating that tonality didn't have to end with the chords and melody he wrote. The instruments he chose to play it, the vocals he arranged, and the way that he chose to record them. Now he could play the recordings too, taking the pieces apart and putting them back together however it suited him. It was an intricate process in the pre-digital, pre-64-track age, stretching to 22 recording sessions that took place in 4 studios over the course of 7 months. As more time passed and the expenses added up, Good Vibrations would eventually cost a then unbelievable $50,000 to record. The song's avant-garde sound, structure, and length, more than 3 minutes and 30 seconds, also unbelievable for a pop single in the mid-60s, became increasingly controversial in and around the group. There was a lot of, "Oh, you can't do this, that's too modern," or "That's going to be too long a record," Brian recalled in 1976. "I said, no, it's not going to be too long a record, it's going to be just right." Still, there were times when the song flummoxed him completely, so much so that Brian would walk into a session, consider the myriad possibilities and problems that lay ahead, and cancel the session on the spot, sending a dozen of Los Angeles' most expensive studio players home without getting a note out of them. But if the intricacies of Good Vibrations scared him, they also enticed him. Even as Brian took a 6-week break from the studio that summer, leaving Good Vibrations in pieces and his family, bandmates, and corporate chiefs hovering somewhere between puzzled and furious, he had already started envisioning an album that would be even more ambitious. He already knew the entire album would follow the modular approach he was trying to master for Good Vibrations, with individual sections flowing into songs that flowed into other songs, that drifted into individual movements, that ultimately formed a symphony. It would be his Rhapsody in Blue. When he sat at his piano at night and gazed out at the lights spreading out beneath him, he could feel something taking shape. It would be the spiritual music he'd been talking about for so many months. A teenage symphony to God was how he began to describe it. Sometimes, when Brian would take a few Desputals, a kind of amphetamine, and stay up late at night thinking and playing, slowly working his way into that inner space where the melodies would start to arrive, he would see small figures moving through the air above him. They seemed angelic to him, and he figured them for the heavenly beings that were delivering the music to him. Brian began to call the album Dumb Angel, perhaps in their honor, but like so many of his plans, this would eventually change. What didn't change was his need for a collaborator. Tony Asher provided just the right straightforward sensitivity for Pet Sounds, but now the music was becoming wilder and more freeform, and the lyrics would have to be just as adventurous. He mentioned all this to Terry Melcher, who had helmed sessions for the Byrds, Paul Revere and the Raiders, and Judy Collins, among others. And the young producer, and son of Doris Day, thought immediately of Dyke Parks. The 23-year-old musician had just written a song called High Coin for Harper's Bazaar, and that tune's playful, punning lyrics seemed to be exactly what Brian was yearning for. Actually, Brian and Parks had already met several times in passing during the previous year. First when David Crosby brought him up to Laurel Way to hear an early acetate of Sloop John B. They'd also bumped into one another at their mutual hangouts in Western Recorders and Lauren Schwartz's apartment, but they'd never really had a chance to get to know one another. So Melcher invited them both to a party at his house on Cielo Drive in mid-July and pulled them together on the lawn to talk things over. They made, at first glance, an oddly matched pair. Brian's tall, pale, and a bit doughy in his striped surfer shirt and blue jeans was always a bit awkward around new people, particularly when it came to making small talk. The bespectacled Parks, on the other hand, was elfin and slight, decked out in a paisley shirt and old-fashioned trousers held up with red suspenders. And Parks, who spoke with a warm southern drawl, could talk a blue steak about his boyhood in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, the years he spent as a child actor in New York and LA, the years he'd spent studying music and literature at Carnegie Tech in Pittsburgh, and the burgeoning music career that had already taken him from the concert halls of the Northeast to the leading folk clubs of LA to a studio career. But really, he was just as interested in discussing the poetry of Bukowski and Ferlinghetti, or better yet, the impenetrable beauty of James Joyce. Parks can't remember what they talked about that night, but it's clear that Brian was impressed. He seemed like a really articulate guy, he said many years later. Like he could write some good lyrics. Brian first suggested that Parks finish off the still incomplete lyrics to Good Vibrations. But while Parks appreciated his new friend's egalitarianism, and was so broke he and his wife were living above a garage in an apartment that didn't even have a bathroom of its own, he was as conscious of his unique abilities as he was of his new friend's commercial success. Thus, he concluded, if they were going to collaborate, it should be on something they both had a hand in creating. Brian saw the logic to that, and off they went. He said, "You write some words for me," and we just started immediately, Parks says.
And I think the reason that I got the job with Brian Wilson was that I had been playing as a musician in Brian's works in the studio. And there came a time to arrange Good Vibrations, to get it done so that I could get more involved, because I wasn't really involved with Good Vibrations. Then I suggested the cello to Brian, because I wanted to see if I could get involved with a little more fancy music. We're going to get fancy here. We're going to get some strings in here, and that aren't in the group that he's working with. And I was less mindful of the Beach Boys, so was interested in Brian Wilson's development and my own. So why don't we try a cello? So he says, great. I get to the studio and there's a cellist and there's a music stand, and his name was Jesse Ehrlich. And he was sitting there with no music on the music stand and rather perplexed. And I was in the control room with Brian Wilson, and I had assumed that Brian was going to write some notes for him. Those notes weren't there, so we went to the chorus, and I said to Brian, have him play eighth note triplets, secco, dry as a bone, the fundamental of the chord, eighth note, da 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 da, and as a result, got the Ruby Slippers moment of the song. I did that by my power of observation. I was there, lucky enough to be in the room with this gent. And I said, Arco. Brian went on talkback. He said, Jesse Van Dyke says Barco. Jesse looked at Brian through the control room window and he said, Barco? I said, tell him with a bow, Brian. So Arco it was. So I got myself a job as a lyricist because of that. Brian was busy being a musician, a genius.
A few days later, Brian asked Parks to come up to his house on Laurel Way. Brian and Van Dyke talked for a while, touching briefly on business matters. The sum of their collaboration agreement went, more or less, like this. Brian asked what Van Dyke needed, and Van Dyke told him he needed a car. Brian asked what kind, and Van Dyke mused that Volvos are supposed to be safe and reliable, and when asked, guessed that they must cost something like $5,000. Brian picked up a telephone, recited Van Dyke's name and address to the person on the other end, told them to cut a check for $5,000 for delivery the next day, and that was that. Not long after that, they were settled in at the piano, where Brian pounded the first chords of the song he was working on, a hurtling country-like tub thumper that reminded Van Dyke instantly of Marty Robbins' El Paso. Yes, Brian said, nodding. He'd actually been thinking about the Old West when he wrote it. In fact, he'd been thinking of calling it Heroes and Villains. Van Dyke picked up a pencil and paper and started to write. Listening carefully to the meter of the melody, Brian was la-la-laing over the chords, making sure the syllables he wrote coincided exactly with the rhythm of the music. Soon he had the opening verse. I've been in this town so long that back in the city, I've been taken for lost and gone, and unknown for a long, long time. Brian smiled and nodded, and Van Dyke turned back to his pad, one ear cocked to the music, the other turned to the sound of his pencil scratching across the paper. They worked that way for hours, both of them feverish with the excitement of their new connection and the thrill of creation. I have no idea if it was day or night, Van Dyke says. Probably both. But we had the whole thing, apart from one section, in one sitting. That was the enthusiasm. As the lyrics took shape, the images that spilled out across Van Dyke's page seemed to take all the feelings Brian sensed inside of himself and project them into vibrantly colored, abstract glimpses into another, parallel world. Set in a lawless boomtown somewhere out in the fringes of the Old West, heroes and villains describe the world lit up by ambition and riddled with gunfire. The narrator speaks as a man who has become part of the scene, but not of it exactly, because he's still so thrilled and terrified by everything he sees. Heroes and villains, just see what you've done, he sings again and again, as the music pivots from minor to major and back again. The indictment, if that's what it is, later expands to take in the sweep of the nation around them. Bicycle rider, just see what you've done, to the Church of the American Indian. By the time it ends, the narrator is aged and seen his own children grow into adulthood. But if he has been transformed by the decades spent in the boomtown, has he become a hero or a villain? That's one question he won't or can't answer. If heroes and villains seem set in the deadwood South Dakota of the 19th century, the struggle it describes, modernity versus tradition, good versus evil, hope versus fear, fits just as easily into the 20th century Hollywood. In a sense, it was a capsule version of American history and the lives of every striver who's tamed its wilderness, laid down its streets, or created the art that described it. It was all there, right down to the booze, gunfire, and greed, and stubborn survival, against all odds, of innocence. She's still dancing in the night, unafraid of what a dude'll do in a town full of heroes and villains. And that gave ignition to the process, Van Dyke says. The engine had started. It was very much ad hoc, seat of the pants. Extemporaneous values were enforced, not too much pro-commitment to ideas. Or, if so, equally pursuing propinquity.
So it was time to put the lyrics on the words, and I did that. And I did it, I would say, without apology. I did a darn good job. So I did my best. I know that. And that is enough for me.
Other songs came nearly as quickly, and so Brian booked more studio time starting on August 3rd. He spent the first day back working on a marimba-dominated instrumental track for Wind Chimes, another new tune he and Van Dyke had written. But the new burst of inspiration also inspired him to go back to Good Vibrations a week later, winnowing his many hours of instrumental tracks down to the elusive mini-suite he'd been imagining since the middle of winter. He'd made enough progress by August 11th to dial his brother Carl in the Fargo, North Dakota hotel where he and the rest of the band had just played a gig at the Memorial Auditorium and pay him. I remember I had it right in the sack. I could just feel it when I dubbed it down, made the final mix from the 16-track down to mono. It was a feeling of power, a feeling of exaltation, artistic beauty. It was everything, he told Rolling Stone in 1976. I remember saying, "Oh my God, sit back and listen to this." The song that emerged, finished in the last week of September and released to the public 3 weeks later, made an impact on popular culture that was both immediate and lasting. Shockingly, Good Vibrations blew past the standard sub-3-minute limit designated as the industry standard by record executives and radio programmers. Good Vibrations sounded like nothing that had ever been played on the radio before, and as it rocketed to the top of the Billboard charts, selling 400,000 copies in the first 4 days and 1 million in its first month, it came to summarize a feeling that had been building in the youth culture throughout the mid-60s. In that sense, Good Vibrations served as a kind of mirror image to Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone, a similarly popular, catalytic, and even longer, though it had been sliced neatly in two for radio play, #1 hit from the year before. Dylan was, and remains, a wonderfully musical songwriter, but the impact of Like a Rolling Stone comes most immediately in its lyrics, which string together surreal images, the chrome horse, the Siamese cat-wearing diplomat, the sad yet sinister person known as Napoleon in rags, and the final rebuke, "You're invisible now," with such striking authority that it forever transformed the vocabulary of popular music. And though the target of Dylan's 6-minute chain of accusations was purposefully vague, its elusiveness only amplified the song's universality. Dylan might have been addressing a lover, the masters of a corrupt institution, or his own arrogance, or perhaps some combination of them all. But as Grail Marcus points out in his book Like a Rolling Stone, Bob Dylan at the Crossroads, it was the overall sound that mattered most. Taken together, Dylan's slashing poetry, the screeching guitars, pounding drums, and wailing organ became a generational cry of frustration and statement of purpose. And if the rollicking, roaring like a rolling stone seemed determined to destroy everything in its path, the meandering, crystalline good vibrations stood on the same ground, pointing blithely in the opposite direction, building a new utopia of its own. Where Dylan's voice was tart and piercingly intelligent, the Beach Boys were sweet and boyish. Where his music was visceral and rough, Brian's was sophisticated and honed to a high shine. And while it was the Minnesota poet's wild, psychedelic language that would transform the culture, it was the California studio wiz's equally wild, equally psychedelic music that sounded like a vision of the future.
When Good Vibrations came out, it knocked me out. I mean, I said, oh my God, what is happening? This is so incredible.
I remember hearing it a few times, or hearing part of it, and then thinking, what the hell was that? You know, was that unusual?
What's going on here? It sounds like almost like a pop record, but it could certainly have been part of a symphony, but a modern symphony.
It has to be Good Vibrations when he blows the industry away, when he blows the Beatles away. The recording of Good Vibrations is what everyone said, what's he going to do next?
I never considered it to be made in bits. I never really analysed it like that. I just listened to it and reveled in it.
At a moment in time where popular music meant more than ever, these songs were reflected on more than any American rock and roll tune ever had. They were the yearning of a new generation, and signposts for a movement that would, for a time, promise to redefine the meaning and possibilities of American culture. As Good Vibrations came to dominate the sales chart and AM radio, Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys found themselves teetering unexpectedly near the leading edge of the burgeoning youth movement. That said, the arbiters of serious culture were not prepared to speak of the Beach Boys in the same terms as Bob Dylan. Certainly, a significant percentage of the literati still dismissed the group as little more than candy-striped tools of consumerism. Skeptics were everywhere, particularly in the United States, where Pet Sounds had been less popular than it had been abroad. But at least some corners of the youth demi-monde, the hippies who hadn't yet been identified in quite that way, had been made to cock their collective ear. They found the new sound at last. The London Sunday Express had raved in its ecstatic review of Good Vibrations. Like the Sunday Express, many musicians understood the significance of Brian's achievements on the album, as did a few members of the small but increasingly influential band of journalists and intellectuals who had begun to apply serious analytical thought to rock music. Not all were convinced, however. I know LA hype when I hear it, sniped Ralph J. Gleason, a San Francisco-based jazz critic whose affection for Dylan had only recently steered him toward the wild and woolly latitudes of rock and roll. Such attitudes dismayed Brian, if only because they reflected an image of the Beach Boys he was actively trying to leave behind, despite the stubborn efforts of his father, the Capitol Records executive suite, and a significant percentage of his own band, none of whom, it seemed, were convinced that the success of Good Vibrations hadn't been some kind of fluke. But it also inspired him, sending him back to the music, which drowned out even the most discouraging words. Brian and Van Dyke worked constantly through the end of the summer and into the fall, usually recording with the studio musicians during the day and then reconvening on Laurel Way in the evening to write some more. High on Brian's Desputals one night, they stayed up until dawn writing a stately two-part piece that began in the darkness of a crumbling, decadent society, then turned to face its inevitable destruction and the dawn that waited beyond. Most of the song was written during the summer, but it remained untitled, and its last verse was still patchy until later in the fall, when Dennis Wilson returned from the band's British tour with tales of how some of the Brits had actually pointed and laughed at the band's striped shirts. Dennis's humiliation, he was near tears as he described it, touched Van Dyke deeply and crystallized the mood of sophistication gone cynical they were trying to express in the song. "We'll call it Surf's Up," he told Brian, and then he had the final lines. "Surf's up, aboard a tidal wave, come about hard and join the young and often spring you gave. I heard the word, wonderful thing, a children's song." Not that the paisley-bedecked Van Dyke was eager to pull Brian back toward the button-down slickness those woefully out-of-step shirts represented, but the Anglophilia that had dominated American pop culture in the wake of the Beatles' invasion had always stuck in Van Dyke's craw, particularly in the midst of a decade in which his nation was struggling to locate its moral bearings in the depths of the Cold War, the throes of institutionalized racism, generational mistrust, and societal divides, and also the war. The darkest side of that fight had come to his family's home just a few years earlier, when his older brother Benjamin, an up-and-comer in the US State Department, had died in mysterious circumstances while on assignment in Frankfurt, Germany. This boy was fed it up. The family dealt with the blow as best they could, but the grief followed Van Dyke to Los Angeles and fueled his muse as he sat down at the piano with Brian. "I was dead set on centering my life on the patriotic ideal," Van Dyke says. "I was a son of the American Revolution, and there was blood on the tracks, recent blood, and it was still drying." 4 decades earlier, George Gershwin had set out to make his Rhapsody a portrait of the nation he knew. "I heard it as a sort of musical kaleidoscope of America, of our vast melting pot, of our unduplicated national pep, or our metropolitan madness," Gershwin had written. Now his 2 young inheritors had set out to do precisely the same thing. As the nights passed and the songs came together, the separate traumas that defined the 2 songwriters' lives and the stubborn hope for the future that they refused to abandon came together into a series of musical vignettes that merged into an impressionistic portrait of American past and present. "I'd just come off this personal Everest and was trying to make a reason of my own life," Van Dyke says. "We were panning for good information, and it all felt very California and very frontier. The whole state of California felt like a frontier to us, and the whole record seemed like a real effort toward figuring out what Manifest Destiny was all about. We'd come as far as we could, as far as Horace Greeley told us to go, and so we looked back and tried to make sense of that great odyssey." Some songs, Heroes and Villains, Surf's Up, and others, emerged whole, with verses and choruses that locked together in obvious ways. Others came out as individual episodes, each of them a discrete segment of the sepia to psychedelic collage of musical lyrical moments that emerged from their shared vision. Some sections were as simple as a description of a barnyard, or the cool air of a clear country morning. Others were more esoteric. Cabin Essence contrasted placid verses describing a frontier home with a thundering chorus giving voice to the coming railroad. The song's climactic section zoomed skyward, simultaneously evoking the Grand Coulee Dam and the electrified future it represents, and the eyes of a Chinese laborer as they followed the arc of a hungry crow circling a thresher working the cornfield. Do You Like Worms told the story of the Europeans sailing for Plymouth Rock, contrasting the hope that sailed with them to, in the reprise of Bicycle Rider theme from Heroes and Villains, a glimpse of the damage they would wreak upon the unsuspecting natives, both on the mainland and then after in the Hawaiian Islands. Another series of sections, including titles as Vegetables and Wind Chimes, describe the transcendent beauty of the natural world, while several others, Wonderful, Child is the Father of the Man, trace the pursuit of God in the face of an increasingly decadent civilization, Van Dyke's lyrics found an elegant balance between the vivid, down-home portraiture and a kind of James Joyce-inspired psychedelia that found its power well past the boundaries of traditional lyrical verse. Similarly, Brian's music contrasted traditional American instruments, banjo, steel guitar, fiddle, mandolin, harmonica, and tack piano, with symphonic arrangements and modern electric instruments. Surf's Up was the locus for all of these threads, but as they wrote and recorded more themes and vignettes, Brian couldn't resist taking apart the puzzle and putting it back together again in a completely different way. Should the end of Heroes and Villains be in the middle of Barnyard? Should Child as the Father of the Man work better as a climax to Surf's Up? Or was I'm in Great Shape actually part of Barnyard? The Heroes and Villains chorus, the Just See What You've Done theme, became a recurring motif, a thread of doubt curling through multiple songs. But every time he'd make one decision, another section would get written and recorded, and all of the options would change again. Brian would come home with more acetate records of the tracks in progress and spend hours playing the sections for his friends in different orders, searching for the most logical progression. The sheer number of sections and vignettes opened up a seemingly endless number of possibilities, and each seemed as perfect as the next. I'd say, God, Brian, why don't you leave it already? Just leave that. It's perfect that way, David Anderle recalled to David Leaf in 1978. Then Brian would spin the discs in a completely different order, and I'd say, well, of course, that's perfect too. And the music he was creating was only one facet of Brian's plans for the future. The door had been opened for a whole universe of experience for me, Brian told a fan magazine interviewer that summer. To some extent, this was due to the books he'd been reading. Inspired by Lawrence Schwartz and the circle of young Hollywood sophisticates he had come to know, Brian had stacked his bedside table high with works ranging from the I Ching and Subud philosophy to tracts on astrology and the novels of Hermann Hesse and the detailed charts of the stars and the planets. And though Brian had never shown much interest in visual art, he was intrigued enough by the cartoon-style pop art he saw at the studio of an artist friend of Van Dyke's named Frank Holmes to let him take a shot at drawing a cover for the record Brian and Van Dyke had decided to title, with maximum hopefulness, as Smile. The colorful, childlike drawing Holmes produced of a shop selling smiles, inspired by an abandoned jewelry store he'd seen near his home in Pasadena, appealed to Brian so much that he asked the artist to illustrate the 12-page booklet he'd convinced Capitol to include with the album. The resulting illustrations were, like the songs themselves, abstract and a bit cryptic. But also like the songs, they projected a childlike sense of wonder that was poignant and just a little bittersweet. Brian's intellectual inquiry was both fueled and muddled by the clouds of marijuana and hashish smoke that drifted in a perpetual haze over the Laurel Way social whirl. Tabs of acid were around too, though that was rare. To the best of my knowledge, he may have taken LSD once, says Michael Voss, a college friend of Anderle who would soon come to work for Brian. He wasn't stoned all the time. Brian went through fads. He had hash because he could get it, and Van Dyke had plenty of pot. But really, Brian had a job to do, and he was a hard-working guy. So just to keep the ideas popping and the buzz going until the sun came up in the morning, there were Brian's ever-present Desputols. Brian gulped fistfuls of the stuff as it turned out, and his appetite for speed was matched only by his appetite for food. He'd have these enormous steak dinners, and then roar off for midnight snacks at his favorite fast food joints, Pioneer Chicken on Sunset or Dolores's over on La Cienega. Marilyn made cookies when he asked for them, and when those were gone, there were always cartons of ice cream and Ready Whip, the stuff in the spray can, which he would sometimes spray right into his mouth. Soon his once wiry frame took on the bulk and presence of a real Beverly Hills pasha. And just like a young royal coming into his own, Brian had begun to think in terms of empire. The Beach Boys had hired a young, ambitious new manager, Nick Grillo, earlier in the year, and he set up offices to oversee the group's career, plot their concert tours, and run their finances. Meanwhile, David Anderley was working to pull together Brother Records, the imprint they planned to use as a more sympathetic, non-corporate home for side projects. Brian also wanted to pursue film projects for himself and the group. Derek Taylor's contract had been extended for the foreseeable future, so he was busily spinning his own brand of quirky Quicksilver hype. Brian had his cousin Steve as one personal assistant and another friend, Terry, performing a whole other set of vital chores and errands. As Taylor was ramping up the publicity to promote the release of Good Vibrations in October, he sent over Michael Vossi to interview Brian in a coffee shop on Sunset Boulevard. Except once they got talking, Vossi discovered that his subject was much less interested in talking about his new single than he was in talking about his other interests. He seemed to want to go off on a tangent about his theory on the divinity of humor, his idea that when you laugh, control goes out of the window. You're doing something you have no way to rein in, and so it opens the door for epiphanies. Vossi's enthusiasm for Brian's ideas seemed to inspire the musician. He called the writer the next morning and promptly offered him a job. The next day I went to see him, and he gave me a really nice Nagra tape recorder, a big reel-to-reel job that you could use to record in sync with a motion picture camera. He sent me to go around town and record water sounds. He explained that part of the new album would be a suite of elements, and so he wanted as many variations of how water can sound as I could come up with. He said, "Take your time. Go to oceans, streams, wherever." So I did, and it was exhilarating. I'd come by to see him every day, and he'd listen to my tapes and talk about them. I was just fascinated that he would hear things every once in a while, and his ears would prick up, and he'd go back and listen again, and I had no idea what he was listening for. Voss's duties expanded with their friendship, and he became a regular companion for Brian, accompanying him on his daily rounds of meetings and recording sessions, then going with him to East Lansing, Michigan, where he flew out to teach the other boys how to play Good Vibrations on stage. Brian had Vossi bring the Nagra on the airplane, and when they got to East Lansing, he had him tape a long, rambling conversation with their taxi driver. Back home, Brian had Vossi appear with him on Lloyd Thaxton's locally televised dance show when he went on to debut Good Vibrations. The appearance turned odd when Brian insisted on bringing out an enormous basket of vegetables he'd had Marilyn prepare, and spoke at length to a very confused Thaxton about the benefits of eating plenty of roughage. Later, Vossi came along with Brian to a meeting at the offices of the then brand new A&M Records to talk about doing a deal. Label boss Chuck Kay was clearly excited at the prospect of doing any kind of business with Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, but his enthusiasm faded noticeably when he realized that Brian had come to pitch him on a strange single called Crack the Whip he'd recorded for Jesper Daly, an elderly photographer who had been shooting some pictures of Brian and the Beach Boys. Jasper, as it turned out, was a far better photographer than singer. "You could see the panic on Kay's face when he heard how awful it was," Vossi says, laughing. "This look of, what the f*** do I do?" He'd really wanted to romance Brian, but Brian only wanted him to like Jasper. To the uninitiated, Brian seemed to be veering between humor, eccentricity, genius, and incipient insanity. At one point during the previous summer, he decided it would be inspiring to feel the beach beneath his feet while writing at the piano in his living room, so he'd had a large sandbox built around the instrument, and then had a truckload of sand shoveled in to fill it up. And there it would remain, at least until he figured out that his dogs, Banana and Louie, were also using the sand for their own creative purposes. A little later, he decided it would be inspiring to have meetings and conversations within the confines of an Arabian-style tent. So he had an elaborate silk tent designed, constructed, and installed. Once the matching silk pillows were in place, he excitedly invited his inner circle through its elegant flaps to give the thing a test run. And they soon discovered that Brian's insistence that the thing he built without a vent at the top meant that the accrued body heat, to say nothing of the varieties of smoke generated, had no way to escape the tent, while fresh oxygen could not find a way inside. The gang tumbled out after only an hour or so, all of them sweating, coughing, and choking, and the tent sat in the living room, mostly unused, for the next few months before Brian finally had the thing torn down. Other passions rose to take the tent's place. When Capitol Records sent him an early home video camera and monitor as a Christmas present, Brian set it up near the sofa in the living room alcove and interviewed his friends Johnny Carson style, Michael Voss. His first show was with Van Dyke, and then wife Dae Parks. And you can imagine how it went. They came on to show how to roll a joint. And it was like Albert Einstein shows you how to get high. Van Dyke Parks. What? I would really like to see that. I'm surprised I'd be on film or tape, but who knows? Shopping one day, Brian's eye was captured by a tall, rotating display of futuristic dolls that came in plastic bubble boxes. Entranced by the doll's shimmering hair and sparkling eyes, he purchased the entire thing, spinning rack and all, setting it up just behind the organ in his music room. He spent hours looking at the stars through his telescope and playing ping pong, then replaced all the furniture in one room with gymnasium mats so everyone could exercise together, when they weren't smoking pot, doing speed, or eating one of the vast steak dinners Brian loved. Everything he thought of seemed to lead somewhere else. They should open a 24-hour telescope store, Brian announced, sticking with the idea nearly as long as his whim to open a 24-hour sporting goods store, so LA's other night owls would have somewhere to buy ping pong tables at 3 a.m. Along with Vossi's water sounds, Brian also captured hours of stoned conversation he had with friends and colleagues, including party games, stage arguments, chants, and weird improvised skits. One night, he became so enraptured with the sound of silverware on the table that he orchestrated his guests in a series of complex rhythms and counter-rhythms, looking for the perfect sound. "We ought to record this! Make this part of the album!" he cried. "You didn't know if it was a put-on or if it was serious," says Danny Hutton, who sat at the table that night. For Michael Vossi, it was all just another day at the office. "I'd been around a lot of people in showbiz by then, and nothing about his eccentricities struck me as unique," Vossi says with a shrug. "I thought he was funny. I mean, he used to write me memos on children's stationery, and he'd always address them to Clark Kent and sign them Perry White. People can look at that now and think he's a wacko. But all these things that people looked back on later as quite alarming were all kind of funny back then." If anything, the new atmosphere of creative and personal experimentation drew people to Brian's door. Brian's usual crowd of musician friends still came up, and with Anderle serving as a go-between, the crowd took on a decidedly intellectual air. Jewel Siegel, an erudite magazine writer who had recently moved to Los Angeles from New York, was so impressed by Brian that he decided not only to hang around regularly, but also document the scene in a long, impassioned article he'd pre-sold to the Saturday Evening Post. Paul Robbins, who wrote for the Los Angeles Free Press, an alternative paper, also became a regular visitor. Still, Brian couldn't charm all of his guests. When Siegel brought his friend Thomas Pynchon up to the house one night, the famous hipster novelist sat in stunned, unhappy silence, while the nervous, stoned pop star, who had dragged him into his then-new Arabian tent to get high, kept kicking over the oil lamp he was trying to light. Brian was kind of afraid of Pynchon because he'd heard that he was an Eastern intellectual establishment genius, Siegel recalls. And Pynchon wasn't very articulate. He was going to sit there and let you talk while he listened. So neither of them really said a word all night long. It was one of the strangest scenes I'd ever seen in my life. But no matter how odd things got at home, work on Smile continued at full throttle. Crafting instrumental tracks in the studio, Brian worked with just as much authority and creativity as ever, coolly directing the mostly older, almost entirely straight-laced musicians on songs that bore little resemblance to anything they had ever played. "It's gotta sound like jewelry," he instructed a percussionist during a session for Surf's Up. Later, he coaxed the musicians to let the rhythm dissipate naturally at the end of verses. "Don't worry about how it falls apart at the end of the verse. That's generally what it's supposed to do," he explained. When bassist Carol Kay found this instruction difficult to reconcile with the standard perfectionism required of studio musicians, Brian eased her concerns with a smile. "Hey, but don't worry about it, Carol." "But I worry," she called back from the studio, only half joking. "You mustn't," Brian said. "You mustn't worry." The article Jewel Siegel wrote, ultimately killed by the Saturday Evening Post editors, but published in October 1967 by a magazine called Cheetah, describe sessions for the fire section of the Elements suite that began when Brian distributed plastic fire hats to the studio full of musicians. All of this was dwarfed by the music itself. A screaming pictorial instrumental composition that combined pounding drums, a sinister repeated bass line, wailing strings, and the high-pitched shriek of sirens to invoke the feeling of fire engines confronting a hellish inferno. At one point, Siegel wrote, "A producer working down the hall poked his head into the control room to see what the ruckus was, and ended up standing there, completely agog, for a long time. This is really fantastic. Man, this is unbelievable," Siegel quoted the guy as saying. "I don't believe it. I just can't believe what I'm hearing." Even now, Siegel recalls that incident clearly. "I still remember how dumbfounded he was just hearing the music come out of the speakers," he says, laughing. Siegel's article would play a significant role in the legend Smile would eventually spawn, but it was the feverish testimony of observers like that pop producer, whose name no one can recall, that created the buzz that spread across the Los Angeles music scene with as much force and mystery as a new batch of Owsley's handmade LSD. "Have you heard it yet?" people asked one another breathlessly. "Have you even heard about it?" And it wasn't just the fire hats and the blazing buckets in the studio, or the piano in the sandbox, the hashish tent, the assorted other oddities that excited them, though that probably didn't hurt. It was all that impossibly strange, yet amazingly beautiful music that only a few select people had been lucky enough to hear in the recording studio or from the acetate records Brian took home at the end of the day. Derek Taylor spread the word even further in the press, sometimes in stories he wrote himself, minus a byline, but with all the charming hyperbole you'd expect from a Taylor piece. Word drifted to New York City, where David Oppenheim, a producer for CBS News at work on a special on rock and roll to be hosted by Leonard Bernstein, decided to feature Brian and his new music on the show. Oppenheim and his crew came out in December and ultimately filmed a segment with Brian, sitting alone at his piano in a burgundy button-up shirt, playing and singing Surf's Up. It was a moving, if understated, performance, and its power was amplified by the narration that described Brian as one of today's most important pop musicians, and Surf's Up as poetic, beautiful in its own obscurity.
I think this music has something terribly important to tell us adults, and we would be wise not to behave like ostriches about it. Besides, as I said, I like it. Of course, what I like is maybe 5% of the whole output, which pours over this country like the two oceans from both coasts, and it's mostly trash. But that good 5% is so exciting and vital, and may I say significant, that it claims the attention of every thinking person.
Leonard Bernstein was quite infatuated with pet sounds and quite interested in Brian because he could hear in that music something that he wasn't hearing in very much pop music at all. And certainly not in American pop music, which were the roots of classical composition, original composition.
All these new adventures are simply extraordinary.
He came out in a television show and said, "This is an important contribution to American popular music of the 20th century."
Many of the lyrics, in their oblique allusions and way-out metaphors, are beginning to sound like real poems.
And though Brian had to back down from an original promise to deliver the album in time for the Christmas shopping season, Capitol Records took out ads in Billboard and other trade magazines promising Smile, with the Good Vibrations sound, in January.
Smile is the name of the new Beach Boys album, which will be released in January 1967. And with a happy album cover, the really happy sounds inside, and a happy in-store display piece, you can't miss. We're sure to sell 1 million units in January.
Anticipation for this new album grew when Britain's influential music trade magazine, The NME, released its annual readers' poll. NME poll sensation: Beach Boys beat the Beatles. True enough, with Good Vibrations still near the top of the charts, the magazine's readers proclaimed the Beach Boys World Vocal Group of the Year, with a hair more than 100 votes separating them from the hometown heroes, who scored 5,272 votes, to the Americans, 5,373. The same poll showed Brian as the fourth-ranked world's music personality, his 3,028 votes landing him just behind third-place finisher John Lennon, and just ahead of Bob Dylan, 1,931. braying his way into the 5th slot. As 1966 whirled to a close, it seemed as if Brian had realized his most audacious visions. The moment he had created, starting with Pet Sounds, screaming into Good Vibrations, and then vanishing completely into the sparkling, mysterious thickets of Smile, had become a perfect wave, a perfectly rigged custom machine. It was everything he'd ever wanted. Commercial popularity, unbelievable artistic freedom, unimaginable acclaim from his peers. All the rules were gone now, all the expectations shaken into dust. Able finally to transcend pop's norms and his own limitations, anything could happen. Anything, it seemed, except what did. Just after the airplane roared off into the morning sky above the Chicago airport, Brian got an idea. He turned to Michael Vossi, recently hired and on his first trip with the boss, and chattered excitedly. "We gotta get everyone together for a portrait." They were still climbing into the clouds then, their backs pinned into their seats as Brian talked his way up to the cruising altitude. They could get the pilot to call ahead to LA and tell Marilyn, he said. Have her book the Beach Boys photographer, Guy Webster, and then call the whole gang together to meet them at TWA Terminal to take the photo when they stepped off the airplane at LAX. Everyone would show up, right? What else would they have to do on a Sunday afternoon in late October? Brian rang his call button and summoned the stewardess to his seat. They'd flown east a day and a half before so Brian could oversee the other Beach Boys' first performances of Good Vibrations at back-to-back shows scheduled for Saturday afternoon and evening in the gym at the University of Michigan. The performances had gone well, and the college audience had responded to the new song, released just 2 weeks earlier and already at the top of the Billboard charts, with such an ecstatic ovation that the other Beach Boys had pulled Brian on stage to take a bow and then join in on their encore of Barbara Ann. Brian hadn't wanted to step back onto the spotlights at first, but the cheers had followed him out of the hall and now onto this airplane, where the altitude had pushed his mood towards giddiness. "I need to get a message to my wife right now," he told the stewardess, filling in the details in a rush of wild enthusiasm. "We need to take a picture. The airport, just call my wife. She'll do everything else." When the flight touched down in Los Angeles late that afternoon, nearly 24 of Brian's closest compatriots were waiting. Webster took a variety of pictures, the group expanding and contracting to form a variety of combinations. Throughout, the center of the galaxy was always Brian, dressed in canvas boat shoes, white jeans, and a light blue t-shirt. His reddish-brown hair swept low across his forehead so that it nearly covered the eyes that regarded the camera so coolly. To look at the pictures now is to see a shy but powerful young man flexing his authority. He's distant, but in command. Surely, Good Vibrations had something to do with that crooked smile that pulls at his lips. After all those moments of work, all the anxiety, doubts, and stubborn belief, everything about Brian's vision was being confirmed in spades. And unlike Pet Sounds, which won him critical praise at the expense of sales, Good Vibrations hit the hipsters just as it did with the millions of kids who were just in it for the fun. But if Good Vibrations was Brian's jet airplane, Smile would be a rocket ship. Propelling him so far beyond the pop universe, he had to come to know that it was impossible for him to say where it would leave him, or if he even had the courage to go through with the journey, because Brian had already started feeling doubts about Smile. They were glimmers of darkness he had been trying to fend off with a constant motion and a vast array of interlocking musical, visual, and completely unrelated projects. But he needed other people's enthusiasm to keep him going. And so every time he saw a flicker of doubt, as in the puzzled, unsmiling faces that greeted him in the TWA terminal, you could nearly see him recoil. And so once Webster had snapped his last photograph, Brian bid the crowd goodbye and left the airport with Marilyn to have dinner alone in an undisclosed location. Later, when Webster showed him a contact sheet of the finished shots, Brian would post a blow-up of his favorite shot on the living room mantle, the Smile class of 1966. And later, after he had discarded it, the airport photograph would take on a symbolic importance, as if it marked the point at which Brian's astonishing creative arc leveled off, nosing slowly toward a descent. It was hard to catch at first, if only because so many things seemed to be happening at once. Good Vibrations was still at the apex of the record charts across the planet, while plans for Smile and all its related projects, the full-colored booklet, the accompanying mini-films, the TV publicity, the articles already being written, were just ramping up into high gear. Capitol had printed up nearly 500,000 copies of Frank Holmes's sweetly psychedelic Smile Shop album cover, a mountain of them stacked up and waiting to be wrapped around the brilliant new music. Then there were all the side projects, everything from the short films Brian shot with the other Beach Boys to promote Good Vibrations, to his scheme for full-length features by, and about, and starring the Beach Boys, to his ever-broadening plans for the group's own brother records, and the various musical and comedic works it would produce. And if that weren't exciting enough, Derek Taylor had started to lay even more of the group's public reputation on the shoulders of its semi-reclusive leader. This is Brian Wilson. He is a Beach Boy. Some say he is more. Some say he is a Beach Boy and a genius. Read the headline of one typical profile, and the text didn't let up. This 23-year-old powerhouse not only sings with the famous group, he writes the words and music, then arranges, engineers, and produces the disc. Even the packaging and design on the record jacket is controlled by the talented Mr. Wilson. He has often been called genius, and it's a burden. It's the last line that's priceless, though the rest of it doesn't hesitate to stretch the facts up to and beyond the breaking point. Given the expert way Taylor, working through a reporter, or alter ego, identified as 60s Hollywood reporter Jerry Feineman, manages to both assert Brian's genius and then shrug it off as a nuisance, in the same breath. A canny publicist with a hipster sensibility and a novelist's eye for poetic imagery, Taylor could sense how well the image of Brian as a solitary, quirky genius would play to the rapidly maturing, increasingly serious rock audience. What the recent LA transplant didn't understand was how such an accolade would echo in the ears of its subject. Certainly, Brian wasn't adverse to being celebrated. He'd even told Taylor that he knew he was better than his reputation gave him credit for being. But as with so many things in life that pleased him, public acclaim had a way of tormenting Brian too. Already the attention he had received within the industry for writing had become a point of contention between Brian and his attention-starved father. The other Beach Boys had long since come to resent that disparity too, particularly when they were the ones earning the cheers on stage night after night. And Brian fretted, how could anyone live up to that kind of reputation? "I'm not a genius," he said to reporters back then. "I'm just a hard-working guy." Such understated humility fed Brian's reputation even more. Everything he touched turned to gold, and the best part was that he was too hip to care. "I never tried the impossible, but I'm always aware of the workable," he said, summing up his approach to innovation at the end of the Feineman piece. But if Brian's musical work inspired more people to regard him as a genius, his personal life spurred others to ponder the thin line between divine inspiration and complete lunacy. Consider his new, overwhelming appreciation for health food. What began with a slight alteration to his dietary regime, very slight as it turned out, and a quirky song called Vegetables, grew quickly into an obsession with fitness that led him to move the furniture out of his living room in order to make room for tumbling mats and exercise bars, none of which Brian seemed all that interested in using. Instead, the mostly sedentary, increasingly chunky musician contented himself with giving evangelical lectures about fitness. Sometimes, as Derek Taylor recalled with a laugh to David Leaf, while digging into a big, fat hamburger. Talking to Leaf in 2004, Brian rolled his eyes at his own youthful contradictions. "I wanted everyone else to exercise. I was too lazy." He was far more willing to join his friends in exercising the outer reaches of their imaginations, particularly when it came to humor or other forms of verbal hijinks. All through that fall and winter, he kept his home tape recorder close at hand, spending hours recording himself and friends while they chanted, played games, had pretend arguments, or just shot the breeze. To dig through the tapes is to hear hours of chants about fishies going swim, and the need for beets and carrots, beets and carrots, beets and carrots. "Everybody talk like Smokey the Bear," Brian commanded in the midst of one chant. Nothing but harmless fun, it seemed to most of his friends. Maybe he wasn't as sophisticated as the sophisticates wanted, and he certainly wasn't as retarded as the surfer guys wanted, Vossi says. But I thought he was funny. I still think he's funny. But not to Dyke Parks, who sounds vaguely mortified while Brian, Vossi, and David Anderle pretend to order treats from a psychedelic ice cream wagon that plays a plinking version of Good Vibrations. Brian was at the piano. As it cruises through the neighborhood. Later, Brian changes the fantasy, pretending to have been swallowed by the microphone. "Van Dyke, you gotta help me!" he shouts. "No names, please. The place might get raided," Van Dyke calls back, unamused. Even now, he shakes his head at the memory. "I sensed all that was destructive, so I withdrew from those related social encounters," Van Dyke says. Nevertheless, the silliness continued. Brian got the musicians at the recording studio involved in the fun too, at one point recording a long session in which the horn players talked through their mouthpieces, pretending they were trapped in their instruments. Intriguingly, given his own near-complete absorption in music, falling into instruments became a standard motif in Brian's comic tapes that fall and winter. Goofing around for the recorder at home, he and Michael Vossi took turns pretending to get stuck inside the piano or the tape player's microphone. And though at least one of Brian's sound experiments, the whirs, bangs, and grinding of people working drills, pounding nails, and sawing wood, would end up being used on a finished recording, other sessions seemed to be inspired by something other than Brian's urge to create compelling new sounds. No matter how frantically Brian worked to write and record his music, no matter how much free time he would consume with his comedy tapes and other enthusiasms, nothing seemed to hold back the shadow that was creeping over him. At times, the darkness seemed to be coming from every direction at once. Nick Grillo's examination of the group's royalty statements from Capitol uncovered years of underpaid royalties. Brian, for instance, had never once been paid for his work as a producer. The group filed a lawsuit against the label, but the move only prompted more tension in his dealings with the executives already impatient to get Smile in stores. Worse, several of Brian's closest aides came to believe that Murray Wilson, who had negotiated and countersigned the first contract, might have had something to do with the situation. How could such a savvy, hands-on businessman have failed to recognize the disparity between what Capitol owed and what they were actually paying? They even speculated that he may have received some kind of kickback in exchange for not tipping off his sons that they were being ripped off. No one knew for sure, but Murray already frightened Brian, and such conjecture only exacerbated the anger, shame, and paranoia that infected his relationship with his father. And all of it only added to the weight of that creative burden he was already straining to lift. That burden was only growing heavier, thanks to both the structural and thematic complexity of the new music, and also to the reaction it had received from his family in and around the band. True enough, the guys had always had to be pushed and dragged through any complicated new assignment. Brian expected that, particularly when they were squeezing sessions between dates on their near-endless tours. But it had gotten even worse during Pet Sounds, given their doubts about Tony Asher's lyrics. Brian had hoped the excitement about Good Vibrations might put them in a more cooperative mood, but he hadn't factored in how the presence of Van Dyke, along with all of the other staffers and assistants and the array of friends that came along with them, would set off alarm bells in the ears of his bandmates and their family and friends. They'd always been suspicious of outsiders, and this crew of intellectual hipsters, who only encouraged Brian's wildest ideas and fueled his weirdest behavior, heralded the worst possible turn of events for a band of pop stars whose wealth and fame stemmed entirely from the songs their leader had once written about cars, surfing, and girls. Still, the vocal sessions had started cheerfully enough back on September 19th, with an evening session for prayer, the choral invocation Brian wrote to start the album. It's a beautiful piece, the unaccompanied voices traveling wordlessly through a series of complex harmonic modulations that rise and fall delicately. But as the group gathered around the microphone in the Columbia studio, Brian sounded too nervous to hear how delighted they were with the first song they'd attempted for their latest album. This could be considered a track, Al Jardine mused, but Brian shook his head. Nah, we don't want to do that. But it's beautiful, Dennis cried. And yet Brian still balked at calling Prayer an official song. This is an intro to the album, take one, he said to the engineer. There was an uncomfortable silence, and it took Carl, the unflappable baby brother, to stir the group's leader from his reverie. Brian, direct, okay? Okay, he responded hastily. Let's try to really pull it off good, okay? The group began to sing, slowly finding their way through the intricate weave of voices in the first verse. A few broken takes later, Brian's attention wavered again, and he called to Danny Hutton, out in the control room. Do you have any hash joints left, Danny? I know that you do. Hutton indicated that he didn't, because Brian groaned his reply. Aww. Nevertheless, drugs remained on his mind. When another take broke down, he turned to someone else and either joked or asked with striking directness, You guys feeling that acid yet? The other Beach Boys were certainly not feeling acid in the fall of 1966. And to Mike Love, the hard-working frontman who prided himself on being in touch with the tastes of the group's vast audience of clean-cut teenagers, no one but a tripped-out acid freak would ever come close to feeling the bizarre new songs Brian was crafting for the group. Good Vibrations had been weird enough, but at least Brian had had the good sense to let him put his own down-to-earth lyrics on top of all that crazy music. Anyone could understand a love story about two people, but what could anyone make of Heroes and Villains, with its bizarre, purposefully nonsensical tale and its constant use of nonsense phrases like sunny down snuff? What exactly was going on in Do You Like Worms, with the rock, roll, Plymouth Rock roll over line? And what kind of song title was Do You Like Worms, in a song that doesn't even mention worms once? And who but a drug addict would know what the phrase columnated ruins domino meant? None of this made any sense to Mike, and when he saw how scattered Brian seemed, particularly when he came drifting into the studio in the company of Michael Vossi or Van Dyke Parks, his fury became obvious. Why were the Beach Boys, his group, suddenly being infiltrated by hippie weirdos? What sort of hippie bull or drugs, or more likely both, were they feeding to Brian? And how could any of this end up producing the Beach Boys' next hit album? Not everyone felt quite so strongly. Carl loved Brian's new music, so much so that he made a point of coming to instrumental sessions when he was in town, adding guitar where he could, and, mostly, watching his older brother work. Al Jardine was a pro, willing to do what he was told when the time came for him to sing. And even if Dennis Wilson was less engaged in the recording process, being far more involved with his various cars, motorcycles, and every other form of adult fun that fell in the lap of a sexy young rock star in Los Angeles in 1966, he was still supportive enough to talk the record up in the press. Smile makes Pet Sounds stink. That's how good it is, he told one reporter. But Mike, on the other hand, was less convinced. More to the point, he was not content to trust his entire career to fan magazine hype and hippie bullshit. I called it acid alliteration, Mike says. The lyrics are far out, but do they relate like Surfin' USA, like Fun, 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 like California Girls, like I Get Around? Perhaps not. So that's the distinction. See, I'm into success. These words equal successful hit records. Those words don't. As Michael Vossi recalls, Mike's obvious distaste for the new songs hit Brian hard. The vibe was getting worse and worse. Brian was trying to complete one of the most ambitious projects in pop music. But the people close to him were rolling their eyes and saying, "Are you sure?" And that really got to him. Brian began to dread the vocal sessions, and often tried to soften his anxiety by getting high in the car while Vossi drove him down to the studio. His drug use only emphasized his other eccentricities and made it far more difficult for him to explain why it was so important for them to all crawl around and make animal sounds for the background of Barnyard, or to groan and moan like primordial creatures to accompany one of the other sections that still didn't even have a name or discernible place in this or any rock and roll record. Everyone was high but me, Al remembered in Goldmine in 2000. Brian made us crawl around and snort like a bunch of pigs on a section of Heroes. It was like being trapped in an insane asylum. It all came to a head on December 6th, in the midst of a recording session for the final movement of Capanescence. They'd recorded most of that a few weeks earlier, but now Brian wanted them to voice the song's final section, which he and Van Dyke called the Grand Coulee Dam. This section, which took up the last minute of the song, began with two contrasting chants. Have you seen the Grand Coulee and Working on the Railroad, that spiraled skyward until they gave way to the song's climactic chant, which Brian had asked Mike to sing as another whirlpool of backing vocals swirled above the backdrop of fuzz bass, banjo, clattering percussion, and cello. Over and over the crow flies uncover the cornfield. Over and over the thresher and hover the wheat field. The only problem with all of this was that Mike had no f***ing idea what any of it meant. And frankly, Mike had no intention of singing a word of this until someone could explain it to him. And that someone was Van Dyke Parks. So Mike, lyric sheet in hand, stalked up to Brian and told him to call this Van whoever the f*** to the studio and explain it to him face to face. So Brian did exactly that, dialing his collaborator and asking him casually, a bit too casually, Van Dyke would soon come to understand, if he might be willing to pay a visit to the studio and help Mike with a lyric or two. Well, sure, Van Dyke said, not feeling the least bit of foreboding as he piloted his new Volvo sedan down to the Columbia Studios in Hollywood. The only person I had any interchange with before this was Dennis, who had responded very favorably to Heroes and Villains and Surf's Up, Van Dyke says. Based on that, I gathered that the work would be approved. But then, with no warning whatsoever, I got that phone call from Brian. And that's when the whole house of cards came tumbling down. What happened next has long become a central piece of the Smile legend, both because it marked a turning point in the album's progress and because it resonates with so much of the psychological and cultural subtext. On the most immediate level, the conflict between Van Dyke and Mike represents the fight for the direction and meaning of the Beach Boys. But in so doing, it reveals even more about Brian's own conflicted ambitions and impulses. When he pitted his new and old collaborators against one another, he was also setting up a duel between the opposing hemispheres in his mind. Was he going to be an artist or an entertainer, a cultural visionary or a pop music entrepreneur? Once music had been the only thing that made sense to him, no matter how bad things got around him, no matter how frantic he got in his own skin, Brian could just wander off into his music and create a reality that didn't just make sense, but actually rang with beauty. Only now the music couldn't keep Brian's demons away anymore, because now they had gotten inside the music. What once had been his escape had now become the primary battleground, and so now he would have to summon all his courage and strength and face them down, man to man. Except Brian couldn't do that. Instead, he got Van Dyke to do the talking for him on the floor of Columbia Recording Studios, with Mike looming over him red-faced and fearsome. "I want you to tell me what it means," Mike demanded, pointing to the line about the crow in the cornfield. He was tall and sharply dressed, consciously hulking over the smaller, bespectacled Van Dyke, who wasn't about to be drawn into an argument about the quality of his work. Instead, Van Dyke dodged the issue entirely. "If you're looking for a literal explanation of that line, or of any line of verse, I don't have it," he replied simply. "You don't know what it means?" Mike laughed. "You wrote it, and you don't know what it means." "I have no excuse, sir." Feeling out of place, out of sorts, and unwilling to become a part of what he already suspected was a family feud with roots and motivations that had nothing to do with Smile, Van Dyke spun on his heel and glided out. Out into the control room, down the hall, and out into his Volvo, determined to never return. That's when I lost interest, he says. Because basically, I was taught to not be where I wasn't wanted, and I could feel I wasn't wanted. It was like I had someone else's job, which was abhorrent to me, because I don't even want my own job. It was sad, so I decided to get away quick. Van Dyke would be back, and work on the album would continue for several more months, but a chill had come into the air. Brian's energies grew even more scattered. His appetite for amphetamines and hashish accelerated, and his episodes of paranoia became more profound and frightening. One night that winter, he attended a screening of John Frankenheimer's movie Seconds. Arriving a few minutes late, Brian had just settled into his seat when a voice from the screen seemed to greet him by his name. "Hello, Mr. Wilson." And if that was freaky, the experience grew steadily more terrifying as Brian saw the other Mr. Wilson suffer a panic attack on an airplane, just as he had done 2 years earlier. Attempt to reconnect with the past by touring an old family home, which Brian had also done down in Hawthorne immediately following his breakdown, and then discover a new self among a group of wild-hearted bohemians, just as Brian had done first with Lauren Schwartz and now with his gang of Smile assistants. Even the beach was in it, Brian fretted to a friend in Jules Siegel's article. Birth and death and rebirth, the whole thing. It was my whole life right there on the screen. Couldn't it be a coincidence? He asked. Brian shook his head. It was mind gangsters, probably in the employ of a wildly envious Phil Spector. I've gone beyond Spector, Brian explained to Siegel. I'm doing the spiritual sounds. It's going to scare a lot of people. Brian's friends managed to talk him down from that emotional precipice, but others loomed no matter where he wandered. After the session for Fire, also known as Mrs. O'Leary's Cow, in December, Brian noticed what he thought was a sudden spike in fires in and around downtown Los Angeles. Had his music created some kind of voodoo spell that was slowly setting the entire city ablaze? Brian found this prospect so terrifying that he destroyed his copy of the tape immediately and vowed that the music would never be aired to the public. Not long after that, Brian became convinced that he was being followed, and that someone was listening to his conversations on the telephone, and perhaps in his house. Brian confessed his fears to Anderle and Grillo, and to put Brian at ease, they hired a team of surveillance experts to sweep his house for bugs. These guys searched the house for hours and found nothing, and nothing, Michael Vossi recalls. Then they drove off in his Rolls for an hour, and came back saying, "We found a microphone in there." Honestly, I think it was a hustle. And then it became another distraction from the music. The security guys started making regular checks of Brian's house and property, but the increasingly fearful musician took his own steps to ensure security. One day he called all of his friends and contacts and commanded them to all change their telephone numbers. Then he decided to move all of his important business meetings to the deep end of his swimming pool. This served two ends, Brian believed, since it was obviously impossible to bug a pool, and anyone floating around half naked in 12 feet of water would probably be more honest than someone hiding behind a suit and tie. Were Brian's fears entirely misplaced? At least one of his friends still believes that Brian, and perhaps Carl, were being followed by detectives hired by Murray, who was eager to find out if his boys were taking as many drugs as he suspected. Still, Brian's fearful episodes worked their way from his immediate circle of friends and acquaintances into the media, and then into legend. Jules Siegel's article made much of one episode in which one of Brian's friends is greeted at the recording studio door by Vossi, who informs him that he won't be welcome at their session inside. "It's not you, it's your chick," Siegel quoted Vossi as saying. Brian says she's a witch, and she's messing with his brains so bad by ESP that he can't work. It's like the Spectre thing. You know how he is. What Siegel neglected to mention in his story was that he was the guy being banned from the session, and that the woman in question was his girlfriend and future wife, Chrissy. So, it seems fair to ask, was she a witch? Siegel says no, but admits that she was a beautiful woman with a powerful personality, who enjoyed flirting with other men. Indeed, Siegel would later write an article about his wife's affair with his famous novelist friend Thomas Pynchon. She was so beautiful she made Snow White look a bit crude. I'm sure this aroused such heavy fantasies that Brian felt like she was in his head, Siegel says. You don't need any supernatural explanations for the effects of that on raging male hormones, do you? Another famous episode involved Anderle, an enthusiastic amateur painter who had been inspired to work secretly on a portrait of his boss for several months. Painting from memory, Anderle had produced a dark, moody vision of Brian, his skin the color of alabaster, his mouth bent in a curious smile, his blazing eyes peering out of a blackness that bristled with icons and figures. According to Vossi, who accompanied Brian to Anderle's apartment, the effect on the painting subject was immediate and intense. He got right up next to it and stared for what seemed like hours, counting the objects that orbited his painted visage and tracing them with his fingertip. Everything about the painting struck him as extraordinarily significant, from the way the spray of icons hovered at the background to the numerological significance of their number and order. He thought it captured his soul, Vossi says. And for a frightened young man who felt his soul was perpetually at risk of slipping away entirely, this was not a good feeling. Van Dyke, who never recovered from his public dust-up with Mike, left the project for good in April, bound for the peace and quiet of Palm Desert, with a contract to produce his own solo album for Warner Brothers Records. Others were falling away too. Vossi left in March, his relationship with Brian undone by the other Beach Boys, who resented paying the salary of an aide who worked only for one member of the group. Anderle would also be gone by the end of the spring, no longer willing to navigate the rocky straits between Brian's creative world and the professional one he refused to engage. Soon the Laurel Way house grew quiet, the happy chatter at the all-night rap sessions and pool parties replaced by the silent churning of Brian's thoughts, and the circular patterns his fingers would make as they searched for melodies on the piano keys. Then Brian and Marilyn would leave the Laurel Way house altogether, abandoning the seat of Pet Sounds, Good Vibrations, and Smile, for a larger, even more elegant, tree-shaded Spanish mansion tucked into the gated community of Bel Air. As winter became spring, Brian's work on Smile had slipped into a frantic pursuit of the single that would follow, Good Vibrations, and herald the album. He conducted an endless chain of instrumental and vocal sessions for Heroes and Villains, searching desperately for an arrangement of melodies, sections, and moods that would give the song the coherence it seemed to lack. More sessions, more sections, more songs. An array of takes for the various pieces of the Elements suite, minus a new Fire section which had yet to be composed. Run-throughs of other songs, some with titles, some without, and then, curiously, a cover of Burt Bacharach's Little Red Book. Then back to Heroes and Villains again. The Capitol execs were keening for the single, baying for a new album, desperate to come up with a follow-up to the multi-million selling Good Vibrations. But Brian could only keep tinkering, recording more and more music that made less and less sense to anyone but himself. Except he was just as baffled as anyone. Brian left the studio for a month starting in mid-April, then picked up again in mid-May, concluding with a session on May 18th for the water section of the Elements, known as I Love to Say Dada. Another session was planned for the next day, but Brian failed to show up, and it was cancelled. And then it was over. A year after Brian had first described the album, he then called Dumb Angel. 8 months since Good Vibrations catapulted the Beach Boys into a whole new orbit of popular and critical acclaim. 6 months since the music industry began to buzz about an album so powerful and revolutionary it could transform not just rock and roll, but all of popular culture. 1 month since Brian had been called a musical genius, nearly, in the Leonard Bernstein special on CBS. In truth, every beautifully designed, finely wrought, inspirationally wielded piece of music made these last months by Brian has been scrapped, Derek Taylor wrote in a British music magazine. Not destroyed, but scrapped. For what he seals in a can and destroys is scrapped. If Taylor's distinction between destroyed and scrapped seems unclear, Brian must have felt the same way. In fact, there's reason to suggest that Brian didn't even know that Taylor announced the demise of Smile, a release that may have been authorized by other factions in the Beach Boys. After all, his final sessions for I Love to Say Dada actually took place 2 weeks after Taylor's statement was published in early May. He finally completed Heroes and Villains in June, though the new streamlined version, sliced down to 3:36 from versions that ranged to 6 minutes to 8 to a rumored, and yet to be discovered, 11-minute edit, did away with the song's more adventurous sections and leaned heavily on newly recorded, stripped-down instrumentation. Brian's Smile era friends would spend decades bemoaning the loss of the original heroes and villains, but in the summer of 1967, Brian felt strongly enough about the new version that he kept it to himself for weeks, waiting for his astrologer, a woman named Genevieve, to identify the perfect moment to spring it upon the unsuspecting world. She came to Brian early in the evening of July 11th, and what happened next would become yet another signal moment in the cultural legend that would come to grow around Brian Wilson and Smile. As Terry Melcher told the tale to Rolling Stone in 1971, it all began just before midnight on the 11th, when Brian gathered his remaining intimates into a flock of limousines and sped from the gates of his Bel Air home down into Hollywood and the studios of KHJ-AM radio, near the Paramount lot on Melrose Avenue. A little fast talk got the flotilla past the guard at the parking lot, and soon Brian and his entourage were parading through the radio station and into the central on-air studio. Here, Brian pulled out his prized 7-inch acetate of Heroes and Villains, the long-awaited follow-up to Good Vibrations, the product of a year's worth of obsessive labor, and presented it to Tom Mall, the overnight disc jockey just then commanding the station's turntables. "Hi, I'm Brian Wilson," Melcher recalled hearing the pop monarch declare. "Here's a new Beach Boys single, and I'd like to give you and KHJ an exclusive on it." Borne up by months of hype and now the assurances of his astrologer, Brian expected Mall to either burst into tears, fall to his knees in prayerful thanks, or perhaps faint dead away with the shock of his good fortune. Instead, the guy just kinda shrugged. "I can't play anything that's not on the playlist," he said, only sort of apologetically. At which point, Melcher recalled, Brian seemed to teeter on his heels, seemingly close to passing out. Mall ultimately was convinced to call his program director at home. "Put it on, you idiot!" Melcher recalled hearing the guy shriek. But by then the moment was gone, and Brian's fragile psyche had already been shattered. "It just about killed him," Melcher said. Released officially at the end of the month, Heroes and Villains notched respectful, if slightly puzzled, reviews. Weirdly fascinating, the UK's New Music Review decreed, but its stripped-down, southwestern meets psychedelic barbershop sound left listeners underwhelmed, particularly in the shadow of post-Good Vibrations hype. In a world still rocked by the Beatles' psychedelic masterpiece Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Brian's Heroes and Villains seemed beside the point. The song peaked eventually at Billboard's number 12 spot, which struck nearly everyone in the Beach Boys camp as both an unmitigated disaster and the final word of this misbegotten folly that was Brian's Smile era. Wounded by the relative indifference to Heroes and Villains, Brian started to plummet, in his flailing attempts to protect himself, mostly by falling back into the grasp of his family and the band they had formed, took on a desperation that soon bordered on self-immolation. Months earlier, when they were still riding high on Good Vibrations, the Beach Boys had been tapped to headline the Monterey Pop Festival in mid-June. But as the day drew close and the event's cultural significance began to seem clear, Brian, who had also been asked to join Paul McCartney, Smokey Robinson, and Mick Jagger, among other youth culture leaders, in the festival's Board of Governors, began to worry. Once Brian had imagined Monterey was the perfect place to publicly unveil Smile, but in June, with Heroes and Villains still in shards and Smile in ruins, he didn't have anything new to play. To make matters worse, they'd be standing in front of a Bay Area audience drawn to hear younger, hipper bands like The Byrds, Jefferson Airplane, and Moby Grape. How would the Beach Boys, still clad in their striped shirts and still boasting a set list full of surfing, cars, and innocuous fun, go over with that crowd? So, only 2 weeks before the event, Brian pulled the group out of Monterey. They needed to work on Heroes and Villains, he said. What's more, he argued, Carl Wilson, just then fighting off the military's attempts to send him to Vietnam by arguing for conscientious objector status, might be too freaked out to sing in public. But neither of these excuses held much water for Monterey's counterculture audience, who might not have tuned in, turned on, and dropped out themselves, but professed deep admiration for the pop stars who had, pleading contractual obligations just didn't cut it. And while it was easier to sympathize with poor Carl and his draft board hassle, surely his darkest hour was a time to take strength in the community, not shun it. So, you see, all good vibrations aside, the Beach Boys had just revealed themselves to be the surfing muscleheads the hipsters had always assumed they were. And when 200,000 flower-bedecked, face-painted fans crowded Monterey's fairgrounds to groove to the tunes, inaugurate a new chapter in American popular culture, and provide the backdrop for the most successful, influential music films in the history of cinema, Brian and the other Beach Boys were shut into a room in his new Bel Air mansion, listening to the sound of their own voices echoing off the stucco walls. Many years later, the Beach Boys sanctioned documentary An American Band would play footage of Jimi Hendrix, perhaps the breakout star at Monterey, setting his guitar on fire amid its dying squeals of feedback beneath a snippet from his Third Stone from the Sun, and you'll never hear surf music again, added for emphasis. It's an unfair juxtaposition for Hendrix, since he bore no particular grudge against the Beach Boys, and was, in fact, a huge fan of surf guitar king Dick Dale, whose then ill health he may have actually been mourning, not celebrating, when he made that statement. But for the purposes of the Beach Boys narrative, the imagery is too perfect to ignore. You know, whenever Todd in the Shadows just plays that clip of Smells Like Teen Spirit to explain what happened to some other band's career, Hendrix did that to the Beach Boys. The coming of Hendrix and all his freaky pals spelled doom for the pink-cheeked boys from Hawthorne, who could have beat Hendrix to his pyrotechnics by several months had Brian not lost faith in Fire, the Element Suite, and the revolutionary album that housed it way back in the middle of winter. But Brian's angels were gone, and his faith had flown along with them. And though he was all but incapable of uttering the statement in plain English, he made it abundantly clear in the music he made to take the place of Smile. Recording almost entirely in the makeshift studio the group set up in the living room of his new Spanish mansion, Brian worked with the other Beach Boys to re-record a handful of Smile tracks in Spartan arrangements that leaned almost entirely on a 3-tiered Baldwin organ someone had recently given him. The vocals come in simple arrangements, with no audible double tracking or echo beyond what can be found in a bathroom, or, in the most elaborate studio trick on the album, the bottom of the empty swimming pool out back. A few glimmers of Brian's sonic experiments come through, but save for the Smile rebuilds, Dyke Parks' elegant lyrics make room for the simple or the downright goofy, while Brian's sonic perfectionism bows to the audio verite aesthetic of false starts, audible mistakes, and fits of stoned giggling. Such organic sounds have their charms, to be sure, but they paled considerably beside the culture-rattling promises that had accompanied Brian and the Beach Boys through the second half of 1966 and the first half of 1967. And those false promises were only emphasized by the new album's self-consciously silly nonsense title, Smiley Smile, and the cover illustration that portrayed Frank Holmes' smile shop lost and alone in a densely overgrown jungle. Released in mid-September, Smiley Smile was the first Beach Boys album to credit the entire group for its production, rather than just Brian. It also didn't crack the top 40 on the Billboard's album charts, thus becoming the worst-selling album in the group's history. Perhaps anticipating this turn of events, Brian returned to the live band, replacing Bruce Johnston, who had sat out most of the Smiley Smile sessions too, for a pair of late August Honolulu concerts the group had decided to record for a live album that they already named, puckishly, Lei'd in Hawaii. Unfortunately, the group's performances were so flat the tapes were deemed unreleasable, but the band remained keen on the live album idea, and perhaps on the bawdy album title, so a few weeks later they all went into a Los Angeles studio to record themselves playing their set a bit more competently, with an eye toward pulling off the old trick of overdubbing cheers, applause, and between-song patter, then passing the thing off as an authentic live recording. But while the stripped down live in the studio takes have some nice moments, the most important track to emerge from these sessions was an outtake of Heroes and Villains that probably wasn't meant to emerge from the studio in any form.
In every recording group's career, there comes that moment when you realize that you have a nuclear bomb on your hands. Right now, Brian Wilson, leader of the Beach Boys, is about to unleash his nuclear power and sing for you the song that went all the way to 40.
Shifting from mock serious to bitterly sarcastic, Mike's rant becomes even more barbed as he goes on.
It topped the charts at about 40, and the next week it just zoomed right off to about 250. Right now it's lurking about 10,000 on this year's top 10,000. Come on in here and sing and wail your buns off. Listen to these outstanding lyrics.
Mike hurls a few barbs at the other band members next, teeing off on Dennis's smoking, Carl's loud breathing, Al's obsessive teeth picking, Brian's eating, but when Heroes and Villains moves to its final verse, he returns his attention to the song itself with added venom, particularly when he hears the group move toward Van Dyke's "Sunny down snuff, I'm alright" line.
They'll just amaze you! This nuclear disaster! This is real life on record. No wonder the stations were inundated with calls the first week this record was out to take it off the air. Thousands of cards and letters came pouring in, downing this record. This is probably my favorite part in all my career, recording. And if it keeps up like this, it probably won't last much longer. Sunny down the old snuff you. If I ever see anything like that again, I'm gonna...
Mike makes a fart sound, then cracks up, suddenly aware of how bitter his rampage had become. From this point, his voice lightens.
Really, folks, it's all in fun. We gotta figure the one hit out of, every 6 years, you gotta get a little animosity generated somehow. Besides, being basically masochists, we kind of enjoyed having this record bomb.
To hear this, particularly understanding the tension between Mike and Brian during the Smile era and the fairly obvious contempt Mike held for Brian's more artistic impulses, is a little terrifying. After all, Brian labored obsessively on Heroes and Villains for months on end, and Mike knew better than anyone how far Brian would push himself in pursuit of the right song, the right sound, even the right feeling behind the voice of one singer in the backing chorus. He knew how his cousin had been raised, and knew how fragile his sense of himself could be. So could Mike really be so spiteful that he'd not only ridicule Brian's most recent attempt at a masterwork, but also commit his words to tape? And then overdub his screed onto the song's musical and vocal foundation? Listen closely to the tape and an answer will begin to emerge. Listen for the high-pitched laugh that follows Mike's cry of, "Wail your buns off."
Come on in here and sing and wail your buns off. Listen to these outstanding lyrics.
Listen for the same voice's even louder guffaw when Mike ridicules "Sunny down snuff."
Sunny down the old snuff you.
Then, when the backing track ends, and even Mike has had enough, listen to that same voice punching in on the control room intercom. "Okay, come on in."
Really, we'll see you back again next time around.
Because that's the voice of the ghoul who had first sketched out and then produced this brutal insult to the memory of Smile. And, as it turns out, the voice of that merciless Smile basher belongs to Brian Wilson.